Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the Sword of Kaigen by Wang. And this one I don't have a physical book on because I did read it on the old Kindle. But this is one I've been meaning to read for quite a bit. And we made it the July buddy read for the Wizardly Duo Discord. And so finally got to read it and talk about it with a lot of different people, which was a lot of fun. Now, I am going to start talking about the book in a non-spoiler fashion, just kind of talking about the book a little bit in general, my general thoughts on it. I am then going to talk some spoilers later in the video. I will mark with timestamps in the description so that you can skip past the spoiler part and get to kind of the end summary if you have not read the book yet and do not want these spoilers. And then we will be doing, it's still kind of, as of filming this, because I'm a little bit early, it's still to be decided when it's going to be, but we will be doing a full spoiler live show discussion with some other people who joined along in the buddy read. So watch out for that too if you want additional discussion on the Sword of Kaigen. So this book, I have to say, was an excellent book. And this was a self-published one, which makes it even more impressive. And there's a ton of stuff I really enjoyed about it, but there were some things that I did not as well. But we'll start with talking about what this really is about. So this is an Asian-inspired fantasy. I think a lot of it sounded pretty Japanese, but there were definitely lots of different kind of cultures, I think, intermixed a little bit in some of what was happening. But it takes place on an area that is called the Sword of Kaigen, and it is like a peninsula, basically, that directly blocks another country that they had wars with in the past, and so they're looked at as basically like the protectors of Kaigen in general. This is the area it's known for its extremely strong fighters. It would be the first to get hit in an invasion, and their fighters believe that they would stop any invasion by the Ranganese. And we learn a lot about kind of the imperial history and how Kaigen used to be a much bigger empire, but the Ranganese had previously fought them and taken over basically part of their empire, made it their own. And we hear about some other countries in the involvement too. And some of the things we start seeing pretty early on were that in Kaigen, it's a very much kind of a like government-run, a little bit tyrannical type state where it very much you are told what is true. And that's what you're supposed to believe. There's not a lot of outside information. It sounds like it's not like as completely locked down as like, North Korea in our current world, but kind of more like China, I guess, where China very much has the all-powerful leadership. They very much control what their citizens are able to like know and consume and do, and so we kind of get the feeling it's that type of country is what Kaigen is as we're going in. And we have two main characters that we follow, the first being Mamoru, who is a young boy who is training to become a great warrior. He's part of a great warrior family, and he is going through basically the struggles of determining who he wants to be as he grows up when he's faced with some hard truths about the Empire and about the way things really are. And then for me, the character that I enjoyed the most by far, Misaki, who is his mother. And with Misaki, we're going through more. We do learn a bit about her past and what had happened to cause her to be where she is and who she is. But we really follow her and her struggles being the mother of children that are destined to grow up to be warriors, living in a country where she really is just expected to be a housewife and obey her husband, and in a marriage where she feels like her husband doesn't care for her at all. Only interest is to create offspring to eventually continue to be warriors. And her passages, there was a lot of really great emotion in there. And it's really an angle that I don't think you get nearly as much. At least in fantasy, I've seen not as many characters who are really following a mother and focusing on the mother's path. The young boy part, that's something you definitely see in quite a lot of fantasy, but it was a really interesting take. And just the way that Wang wrote emotional scenes was just fantastic. And there's a ton of emotion that it really you get sucked into. In this book, I was pretty invested really, really early. It did not take long to get me into this book. and I was super interested to see where it went. But we followed this kind of journey of finding out. There's a lot of finding yourself, despite all the things that have happened to you. There is a lot of action as well. But this focuses less on like action and more so on the emotional story is really where the story goes. Now, before I get into the spoiler part, just to kind of briefly talk about some of the things that I wasn't a big fan of, that actually was mostly the kind of like elements that pulled away from the direct story. Something that I thought was a little bit of an odd choice was the fact that this does take place, despite the fact that Kaigen is very like traditional backwaters, they still train with swords and bladed weapons like that. This does take place at a time in the world where technology very much exists. Like they have TVs, there are like fighter jets, there are satellites, there are, cell phones kind of. Is the way to explain. Like there definitely is technology. We're living in this very like this area that doesn't use a ton of it. Like they have TVs, so they can get like the government news broadcasts, but nobody like would be carrying a phone. There's like one communication device that the mayor has, but one plotline too is they're installing basically like cell phone towers as well. And so all of that kind of felt a little bit odd. And for the most part, I think it still kind of worked with the story. But when we talk more spoilers, I'll talk about why that became more of a problem for me. But the other thing is the fact that I didn't realize fully. I'd heard that this was supposed to be like tied into some other books, but this acts as sort of a prequel to Wang's two other like YA novels that she'd written on the same world. And the parts that were done to connect them were my least favorite part of the book. There were some flashback chapters that I didn't care about as much, but they were still pretty well written, and they did a lot to explain why characters were the way that they were, so I think they solved the purpose. But at the very end, the last chapter, which is like the longest chapter of the book, it really acts more as like an epilogue, I think, and it's basically completely to kind of tie it in, and I just think that some of those elements being taken out could have really elevated this book to just astronomical levels, because this was still a fantastic book that I enjoyed quite a lot. Those things just took a little bit of like my absolute enjoyment, and I think some of the potential of what this book could have had. So with that though, I do want to get into discussing more with spoilers to get more in-depth in my thoughts. So from this point on, there will be spoilers. I will kind of summarize and do like the video ending type stuff at the end, so you can check the timestamps to skip past this section to the end summary part if you do not want spoilers. But from here, I will be talking spoilers right now. So, I talked about the characters a little bit and the pieces that were kind of like the technology and the other stuff. But the big thing we're focusing on here is, of course, we have a Mamoru dealing with the fact of finding out that the government's lying to all of the citizens and struggling with that despite the fact that he still wants to be a warrior. And then Misaki, who's dealing with her past, where she was like a crime fighter and she was a very skilled warrior herself, and also just basically like didn't want to get married and feels like she's a completely loveless marriage. And we're building up to the fact that the Ranganese are going to be invading again and attacking Kaigen, and that's where we get kind of in the middle of the book, we get that huge climax. And I liked Mamoru's story just fine. I was a lot more invested in Misaki, kind of learning about her past and her struggles with just basically having the will to live, how she feels no connection to her children because she knows they're not really hers. They're just going to be taken by their father to become warriors. And just she didn't really, care about them. She doesn't care about her husband, and she doesn't feel that connection. And her going through that to kind of discovering that she really does have, the capacity to love her children, and even later, her husband, finding that out, especially with Mamoru just a little bit too late, was so fantastic. Now, it's weird that the kind of like the pinnacle, the climax of this book is pretty much smack dab in the middle, with the Ranganese invading, all the warriors fighting, most of the male adult warriors dying, and Mamoru also dying. I did really like the most emotional parts of the book for me wasn't even him dying, it was the aftermath and Misaki dealing with it, and just feeling like she just kind of really started to feel connected to him and then to have him taken away. And just kind of that anger, and her dealing with that was fantastic, and it was really great. and I very much enjoyed that. And then we go on from there too, with her kind of actually dealing with Takeru, her husband, and realizing that he's had issues too, and he's always been like afraid that he would hurt her and she'd turn out like his mother, because his mother and father had a horrible relationship as well. His mother ended up dying, and so he's so afraid of that he basically just tries to like leave her alone, and kind of that misunderstood. And they're really like, you don't get excuses for him being the way that he is, but you do get some explanation. And I really enjoyed that the author here doesn't just immediately have them be like, oh, we loved each other all along. Like, no, it's definitely like they learn that they can work together and they can coexist. And then you get just kind of like the hints that love may actually come later, as they become partners in trying to basically rebuild their lives after the sword of Kaigen is decimated by the Ranganese attack, and then by being bombed by the Kaigen government and their Yama allies. And there was so much there that I thought just worked really, really well. My big thing, like I said, is I have a problem with when we have all this technology, why Ranga wouldn't just like shoot a missile. This is addressed later, and so that was something I kept thinking about. It is addressed later that basically they were kind of like testing to see if they would be able to invade and like hold the land, basically, and so they sent their best fighters against Kaigen's best fighters. But it's still just kind of like, it doesn't make that much sense to me that they would also send these old-fashioned warriors when they could use new technology. Because and I'm guessing that maybe they also have, they obviously have these warriors, but it's believable that Kaigen is this very small, or the sort of Kaigen, is this very small community in the mountains where they still, keep to the tradition. It's done in a way that I can accept that. I have a problem believing that, every other country or even this other country also, like, did the same thing and have this whole army of old-fashioned fighters to come in. Now, granted, magic is a huge role here. And I think, too, when you take a look at the fact that, these people do have magic, the people in Kaigen, they have, like, water and ice magic. And the Ranganese, they have, like, wind magic. There are other people that have fire magic. And so all these different elements. So magic definitely does make a difference, because if you can, use magic to fight back against some of the greater technology, that definitely can make a difference. But, there's no ice shield that's going to stop you from just shooting a missile and blowing the whole thing up. So I still kind of I felt like that was a little bit odd, but that starts to wrap around to, it's where the outside world parts, I felt like weren't nearly as important to the story. There were the parts that I didn't enjoy as much. And so I just feel like that was something I definitely would have done a little bit differently. I think there's a way you could have written this book where you aren't really looking at the technology, and you kind of make it so that the climax happens at a different point and kind of cuts out some of the massive amounts of falling action. I still really, really enjoyed most of the falling action, but it's as you get further and further in, you're just like, okay, we're still wrapping up here. The flow was a little bit off because of that style of pacing. I think if you take out some of that, you can still have, some of the fact that, the government is still telling people what to believe, and that sort of thing as well. And you could still have part of that in, because the character who ends up bringing that in, which is Chung Ho Lee, I think, he and his father come from another area, so maybe they, came for a different reason than to install cell phone towers, but you could still have that happen. But then having the battle basically happen over a longer period, maybe, or just having it happen a little bit later. Like, we could have started having Misaki and her husband start to, realize as they have problems with their son and everything, they start to realize that maybe things aren't adding up as they start getting reports of the attacks. Like, we could have taken some of that and put it a little bit earlier, and then had the actual battle happen later. And then instead of having somebody, use their cell phone to call the government, you could have had, like, somebody has to go travel and go get reinforcements to help out, which would have slowed that down too. And so a lot of the same plot points I feel like still would have worked by doing it just a little bit different. So that kind of just wraps up how, and granted, once again, this is still a fantastic book. This is just basically like, as I was reading, I kept thinking to myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I'm going to talk about it in review. That for me, that would have elevated this into like one of my favorite all-time books, because so much about this was so fantastic. But some of those other things just took me out of it a little bit, and those were kind of the big things. And the last chapter, which I know is pretty controversial, the tie-in, it's just like, it still sort of was fine, but it's basically Robin comes from her past, starts explaining all the things that he's been up to, and that's going to involve, I think, children from this book once they're older going to the Daybreak Academy, and it's just that part and like those scenes before too felt very YA, and so they felt just a little bit out of place for me. And I didn't really mind them terribly throughout, but then when we just are like so obviously being like, go read my other books, this is a prequel, I'm gonna title in. I just, like I said, this story being completely disconnected, maybe even being the same world, so you still have all the element of powers, but being like much further in the past. I just think, for me, that would have been better. That just is something that I think could have elevated this, even higher than the really high standing I put this in. This was absolutely a 4 out of 5 star book for me. It's just, definitely I think things could have been better in that way. But like I said, I was blown away by this book. I'd heard basically nothing but good things about most of the book, and people talking about how sad it is and the emotion, and just Misaki as a character was so beautifully written, and her just pain going through everything she's going through with, once again, like feeling disconnected from her children and her husband, just trying to like eke out her life when she wanted other things. But basically her father ordered her to marry the man that she did, and just kind of like that whole relationship, her dealing with losing her son was so beautifully written too. The aftermath there, and just trying to pull it together, and her scenes with her husband as well. All of that, I just basically, anytime we were looking at her in the present, I was so entranced, and it was just beautifully written. And it's really hard to believe that this is from an author who really doesn't have a whole lot of published work, and I mean, even this book itself being self-published, because there was just so much skill with the way that she writes emotions. I was just, once again, blown away by how much I enjoyed so much of this book, despite my complaints that I spent a little bit more time talking about. Those are really, like I said, the only issues that I had. Some of them are bigger than others, but it's still, this book would have easily been a 5-star for me without some of those things that I mentioned. Even if it would have still been like in the same time period. I'm not saying it had to change everything, but if it would have still been in the same time period, but just taken out some of those extra things, like the last chapter, it would have easily been 5 stars, and I was thinking it was going to be. Those just really, they affected me enough in a negative way that I'm like, I'm dropping it down to 4, which is still a really good rating for me. That means I really, really liked it. It just didn't elevate to like that upper echelon of loved because of some of the issues I had with it. And I know several others who read it also had less problems. Some people agreed with me as well in the Discord, but those were really my thoughts. It'll be interesting to talk more about this in the live show as well. So really, that is the bulk of my thoughts here on the Sword of Kaigen. Like I said, this is a fantastic book. I definitely recommend reading it. There are just some of those issues like I mentioned, and I still think counting the last chapter as an epilogue, thinking about it that way, I think will give you a little bit of a better experience if you're going through and reading for the first time. And it's there's so much to love here. Just the emotions, the way that they are written. The character of Misaki, who has to be probably one of my favorite characters, definitely goes up into that rank, just based on how well she was written and her path through life. There was so much depth there, and I'm really excited to see more of what this author does in the future, based on my enjoyment of this book. Despite some things that I think could have been done better, this was still a fantastic book, and I would absolutely recommend people read this, just kind of in general. It is very sad, but it's just beautifully written, and it is a really great book, in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts if you have read this, or if you did skip the spoiler section. If you're excited to read this, let me know too, down in the comments below. And like I said, watch out for, we'll be posting something for the live show for this book too, which will be having some other creators collaborate and talk through and just give all of our thoughts in a live show format for this one. Check out, if you want to see any of our discussion on this book or other books, check the link in the description for the Wizardly Duo Discord. Join in the discussion there. Always a ton going on. We do buddy reads at least one every month. A lot of like unofficial buddy reads too. People are always starting buddy reads, but just like, hey, you want to read this? And goes from there. So it's a great place for discussion, for finding buddy reads, and all kinds of things there. So definitely check it out. And of course, if you enjoy my content and would like to see more, then make sure to subscribe.